I adopted Bento in 2010 from a shelter. As it turns out, we have very similar personalities. And this cat.
Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to session 6 of my AAA character modeling workshop. In this stream tonight, I'm going to be talking mostly, once again, about hands, what goes into making hands, and especially what goes into making UVs for hands. I'm going to be talking about various topics related to modeling hands, UVing hands, and different methods for doing UVs for hands. But I also have a little bit of house cleaning to do and stuff like that. Um, and a few things to go over before I really get into the meat of what I'm talking about tonight. So first of all, next week, the schedule for streams is going to be slightly different. Instead of a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, I'm instead going to be doing Tuesday, Wednesday. On Thursday night, I'm actually going to be at the Gnomon School of Visual Effects. I'm going to be visiting there, watching some of my coworkers give a talk, and then hanging out with some people. It should be a pretty neat, little instructional speech that they're giving. I believe they're going to be streaming it live. It's going to be about becoming a better video game artist. That'll be presented by Gavin Goulden, who's my lead, and Jason Hickey, who is the lead environment artist at Insomniac Games. And that will be next week on the 24th at 7 p.m. I believe it's 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're interested in checking that out, make sure to keep an eye out online. Looks like there's going to be a live stream on, on live stream and on YouTube. And let's see, it looks like it goes from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. and there will be a long Q&A during that thing. I'm not going to be participating in it, but I'm just going to be there for moral support, but that's where I'm going to be. So that's why the stream is going to be on Wednesday night instead of Thursday night. It'll be at the same time, same Twitch channel, just on a different day. So keep that in mind. The event will be streamed, like I just said. There's a link at the top of ArtStation right now that has a picture of Spider-Man on it, so you can just go there and click on it. It has information about it, has information about the people who are talking, and it should be a pretty cool thing. So if you're there, I look forward to meeting you. If you're not there, if you can only just tune in from the internet, I hope it's good. So with that in mind, next week, in addition to me being on a slightly different schedule, I'm going to be talking about a few different things, and next week is where things are going to start to get a little bit loosey-goosey with this whole thing. So next week is when I'm going to start talking about a variety of topics that are all sort of interconnected, one of which will be doing UV maps for characters. I'm also going to be talking about hard surface, clothing, doing UVs for clothing, doing UVs for hard surface, specifically for characters, and all those things are going to kind of sort of wind together, and I'm going to be talking about each one of them at specific different times, probably throughout the course of the next 2 weeks. Additionally, I'm going to be talking about creating hair cards, because that is so dependent on the UVs that you use for the textures. I'm going to be talking about laying out UVs for clothing, for good deformation, good texture layouts, efficient texture layouts, that type of thing. I'm going to be doing a little bit of work in Marvelous Designer, nothing major, just a little bit of really basic stuff to get some basic clothing for this werewolf guy. I'm going to be making probably some sort of vest, some pants, and probably some kind of satchel that he can wear that's sort of draped diagonally across him. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about hard surface stuff. I'm going to be talking about how I'm going to be making some shackles for this guy, along with things like buckles and buttons for the satchel. And I may make some stuff like zippers or buttons or, little clasps and belts, that type of thing. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to tune in next week. I'm going to be covering all of that stuff over the next week and the week after that. And I'll probably be ending with talking about things like hair cards and other small miscellaneous things. I'll be going over a little bit of my workflow, bringing things from Marvelous Designer into ZBrush, and then from ZBrush into do Retopo on it. And it'll be a nice sort of collection of things to talk about. I'm sure there will be lots of good questions that people will be asking. So yeah, should be great. So tonight, like I said before, I'm going to be talking mostly about hands. Hands, despite being a pretty big topic, are probably not enough to, at least the UVs for hands, even though I'm going to be making UVs for these hands tonight, are probably not enough to fill up the entire 2 hours that I'm planning on streaming. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the Twitch chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. Then after the stream is over, just like usual, I'll be getting into the private Google Hangout to talk with people who signed up for that. But while the stream is up, I will be answering your questions. I'll be, I'll be able to talk about any number of things, not just hands and UVs and that type of thing. And I'll try to, keep things moving along, keep things interesting, and you can really ask anything about game development that you think I might know, or even if you don't know if I know, feel free to ask, and I can either say I just don't know, or I can try to point you towards resources for it. So with that in mind, let's talk about UVs for hands. Let's get started. Let's jump in and talk about different ways that you can lay out UVs for hands. And then we can sort of get into the different ways that UVs work for hands, the different layouts that you might want to use for hands like this guy's hands, the different layouts for hands in different poses, and sort of talk about the advantages and disadvantages of having different types of poses for hands. Then finally we'll talk about different ways of laying out topology for the best UVs on hands, and we'll talk a little bit about hands in the context of, say, gloves and things for sci-fi characters, or somebody who's going to have armored fingers like a knight or a some sort of spaceman or something. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's start talking about the hands for this crazy werewolf character that I've been working on over the past couple of weeks. And then after that, let's talk about how we can apply those lessons we've learned next week, and apply those lessons to different parts of his body. So let's go. Alright, so these hands, I made these on Tuesday, and you'll notice several things about them. One, I have a big row of ingons right here across the back of his hand. Now, in a lot of cases, people will tell you that ingons are bad, you shouldn't use ingons. In some cases, they're correct. In others, they're just full of crap. I believe that I've gotten into the reasons for that, over the past several sessions, why you can actually use ingons to your advantage. Because they subdivide cleanly into quads, as you can see here, because they provide nice, clean layouts for things. But let's also talk about other areas, like down here, in between the fingers. In between the fingers here, I have a few things going on. I have these quads, which are just laid out in a very simple manner. But they also have, because they're laid out in a simple manner, they're also easy for me to work with. Not just in terms of, subdividing, like you see here, and providing me with nice clean geometry, but they're also laid out so that I have a seam which goes along the entire middle of the hand. And if I continue it up along here, you can see that It goes all the way through the middle of the thumb, through every single finger, and eventually up through the rest of the arm. Now this is really good for me when I want to do UVs, because what it means is that I can unwrap the entire hand as one single piece by just having two seams. One seam along the wrist, right here, and then one seam that just continues along that hand. Now, one thing that I'm going to do right now is just focus on the hands by hiding everything else, though there is something I want to bring up, which is if you are making characters that are going to be wearing clothing, especially clothing such as long sleeve shirts, jackets, that type of thing, or making characters that are going to have hands that are reused between many different characters, which is something that's very common in large open world games or games that just have lots of characters in them. You might want to do something which might seem a little bit unintuitive at first. And that is to actually move the seam for the wrist up to the middle of the forearm right here. Now, why would you want to do this? Why would you want to move the UV seam up to a place where it's going to be right in the middle of what you're seeing on the arm? Well, despite the difficulties that having a seam in such an obvious location can present, it makes things easier for modeling and rigging purposes to have the seam higher up on the arm, because what it does for you is it gives you more of the wrist to play with when you unwrap the entire hand as either a single UV island or multiple UV islands, and then copy and paste that between characters. If you have characters wearing long sleeves, or sleeves that only go down to, say, halfway around their forearm, then what you're going to be able to do is optimize things so that you don't need the entire arm. Instead of needing the entire arm, needing everything that goes all the way up to this shoulder up here, and oh my, that's an uglier loop than I thought it used to be. Well, we'll fix that later. Instead of needing that entire arm inside of a sleeve, where you can potentially run into clipping issues, or you can run into problems with the inside of the elbow here, clipping through the inside elbow of a jacket, or the back of the elbow here, clipping through the outside of the jacket when the arm bends. Instead, all you really need is the hand and a bit of the forearm. That saves on memory by not having to load a material for the upper arm. It saves on polygons, and it saves your rigger from having trouble keeping the interior parts of the arm from clipping through any sort of clothing. Now this is something I'm going to be talking about a little more over the next couple of weeks when I get into clothing, but I figured it was useful to bring up, and it's something that I'm actually going to be doing right now. Putting the UV seam higher up as opposed to down here so that I can have a very consistent usage of this hand across multiple characters. Or when this guy's wearing clothing, if he is going to wear clothing, say he has maybe cool baggy Renaissance sleeves and a sort of torn up rest of his shirt, it'll be easy for me to use his hand and a little tiny bit of his forearm going up those sleeves into a place where you're never going to see. So let's get that started right now. We're going to cut his arm off right there, or rather his hand off, and unwrap this entire section right here. So let's just cut that and hide everything else. We're only going to be worrying about this for the next, hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And this is what we're going to be looking at. Additionally, if you have a UV layout, or a topological layout like I have here, where the seam going around the hand continues up until, say, a point right here, or maybe over here, somewhere along the middle of the wrist. If you have this seam going up here, it's very easy to select a seam along here that will be hidden along some midpoint on the bottom of the arm. Now it's not 100% perfect right now, but it is pretty good for what we're looking for right now. So I'm going to start UVing this, and I'm going to start talking about the philosophy behind UVing it one way versus another way. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is just get a little bit more resolution right here, because I'm not happy with how low res the middles of these fingers are. So I'm just going to do that. There we go. That's a little better. Alrighty. So let's start UVing this hand. So here is where the UVs currently sit. And if I go to the UV edit mode here, and I just unwrap this, now it is going to be kind of ugly because of some smoothing algorithm stuff, but you will notice something. One, I have a nice big UV island right here, which is easy to work with and represents the entire back of the hand. This is pretty handy. This, no pun intended. This is useful to have because, one, it reduces the distortion on the backs of fingers to have the entire back of the hand unwrapped as one island, and it also makes it easy to work with because I can start moving bits around in different ways. For example, I can use some of the conformal deformation tools in the UV tools in Modo and start just moving things around in very large ways on a single island. And what that'll do for me is allow me to resize fingers in the UVs so that each one is the appropriate size. You know, relative to the rest of the hand, that is. So for example, here's the middle finger. I want the middle finger, since it's the longest, I want that one to have the most space in the UVs. So I'm just going to mush things around until they have the right amount of space. By that same token, the pinky over here is going to be the smallest one, so there we go. Oops. Now this is not perfect, this is just a very rough, quick example, but it sort of shows you the effect of unwrapping things as a single UV island. And let's drop a grid on here to see what the distortion is like. Let's resize this so the tiling is more apparent. So here you can see that when I unwrap things as a single UV island, you get very, very continuous texture all the way from up the wrist down the fingers with very few visible seams. The seams are just going around the outside here. So that's the only seam you need to worry about. And, conveniently, this seam is mostly in places that are going to be hidden, either between the fingers or right along the tips of the fingers where they're going to be covered by claws on this guy's hand. If they were on a normal person's hand, they'd be covered by, say, fingerprint texture or the edges of fingernails, so you wouldn't really notice seams so much. We've got a question in chat, which is, what is the UV mushing feature in Modo called? In Modo, there are a lot of different UV tools. The one that I'm using right now is the UV Relax tool. It's under the Spread drop down right here, and I'm using the conformal UV Relax mode. Now if I have interactive checked, what that allows me to do is just drop little anchor points on any vertex, and then I can pull those anchor points around to start adjusting things. Now this is not something that's available in the other relax modes, but it is available in this one. It's one that I use a lot with organic objects. It's not so useful for mechanical or hard surface objects, mainly because a lot of those have, you know, say proportions and scales that don't play well with the sort of smoothing algorithm that this specific relaxation mode uses. All right. So here's something that's starting to approach something fairly usable as far as hand UVs go. But we do have a problem, and that problem is that we can't actually see the palm of the hand. The palm of the hand has been hidden because I'm just working on the back of the hand right now, so there is some more work that I'm going to need to do. However, you can see that one big advantage of unwrapping the entire back of the hand is that it's easy to get the tiling for a UV texture to mesh really, really well. And if it's subdivided once, it gets a lot smoother, and you can even see that a lot of the distortion just sort of disappears. All right. So, I'll just take a little sip of my wine and continue. All right, so we have the back of the hand here. Let's just move that out of the way so we can start focusing on the palm of the hand. So once again, just because of some of the smoothing algorithms that Modo uses, the initial unwrap might be a little bit messy, but here, let's hide that background real quick. Let's just try unwrapping this again, and we can use a few different methods for it. It's okay. We're going to try using that same conformal algorithm again. And just pull some of those fingers out. Now there are other tools like this out there. They're just not necessarily as common in other programs, but you will find other UV tools that are similar to this. So you can see, once again, just by mushing things around a little bit, using the basic UV tools that I have here, I can get something that is starting to approach being very usable. Let me just place some anchor points with the boundary locked, and that'll make it so that it's easy for me to get better proportions on here. We want the tips of these fingers to have a little bit more UV space because right now they're pretty tiny on the UVs. There we go. So let's unlock that boundary and drag these around a little bit. That's looking better. Here we go. Now you do notice there is some overlap here. This big red area is an area of overlap, but we'll not worry about that right now. That's not as important as just getting decent proportions. Once we have decent proportions, then we can go back and fix some overlaps. Here we go. So there's the middle finger. The index finger and ring finger are more or less the same size, and the pinky is the one that is the smallest. Let's just fix the tip of that finger. Here we go. I can fix that one. This one. Alright, we can remove that. Do this. Alright, let's make that fingertip a little bigger. Rest of the finger smaller. Pull things around a bit so it matches the ring finger. Okay, so this is not perfect, but we're starting to get good results. And once again, just like with the back of the hand, when you unwrap the palm of the hand as a single island, it's very easy to get good results and good seamless results across the entire palm of the hand. So this entire area has no seams. It only has seams around the outside of this UV island, which is very handy. Once again, no pun intended. It makes it so that it's very easy to hide any problems by just painting out along a single line. So let's see what happens when we have the two halves of the hand, the front and the back, exposed. Let's just move these down. And, alright. Oops. Okay, so as you can see along the side of the hand here, this line, it may be kind of difficult to see in the stream because of compression, but this line along here, that's where the UV seam is, and you can see that there is some texture mismatch along this part of the hand. Now we can fix that. That should be fairly easy to fix in most UV programs, and then that can be relaxed. The main thing that we need to keep in mind is that, once again, still, the seams are mostly hidden. This seam right here, where there's a large mismatch between the texel density of one part of an island and the other, is mostly hidden. That's going to be in a place where you're not going to see it very often. That's really, really good for us. So let's try doing this all as a single island. Just hide this, undo that. Let's try unwrapping this as a single island and do something very similar. Let's make sure that we have everything. Okay, there's the edge of the seam. It goes along the curvature of the finger and around. Okay, so let's unwrap this as a single island. And start playing around with this one. See what we can do with it. See what we can do to further reduce the visibility of seams and other potential problems. Alright, so if you noticed, when I was actually selecting seams for the edges of this hand, one thing that I specifically did was unselected the seam, unselected the edges that go along this side of the hand. Now, why would I do that? The main reason for deselecting these edges when I want to select where the UV seams are put is so that I have at least one continuous area where there will be minor distortion and it will be very easy to unwrap the entire thing as a single UV island. Now, because of the nature of the little finger area and the back of the hand over here, or the edge of the hand over here, this is the area which it's easiest to straighten out as a UV island. As a UV seam, this is the easiest area because it's really just one continuous curve along there. It just follows a curve like this. Now, if you were to do the same thing over by the thumb, you'd run into several problems because the thumb is shaped sort of like this. Now, that's an exaggeration, but it does have a lot of shapes that will not easily be unwrapped as one single unbroken line that doesn't have a lot of distortion in it. So that's why we would put the UV seam along there. That's the area where we want it to be the most relaxed and the least straight, so that's where we put the seam. Now, granted, that does make it slightly more difficult to paint out some errors if you're just painting on the unwrapped textures. However, since we now have tools like Substance Painter, even things like the Quixel Suite, or there are lots of 3D painting tools out there. Now that we have those tools, it's a lot easier to cover up those seams. And because we put the seam in that place where I mentioned before, it's going to be easy to hide, since people are mostly going to be looking at the outside of the hand over here. It's going to make life generally easier for us. People are probably going to be seeing the outside of the hand over here a fair amount, though not as much as, say, this part of the hand. So it's better that we put the join along this part. So now let's take this UV island, kind of mush it into shape, and look at the distortion, look at how we can fix distortion, and then start looking at how we can unwrap the hand as multiple UV islands to do things like increase texel density and decrease distortion. So let's get that started. Let's first lock the boundary again and start using some of these same tools that we had before. Let's just pick an anchor point here, one over here. Let's put some along each finger. It doesn't really matter where because we can move them later on. Let's put one right there. That's the thumb, ring finger, middle finger, index finger, and this little nubbin is the thumb again. Right down here is the wrist. So let's unlock that boundary and start pulling these around. Now we want the little finger, which is where the seam is not, right along here, to be the smallest finger. So we're going to pull these up so that they take up more UV space. here so that we can pull the thumb out. There we go. Pull this up. So, over here on the left side is the back of the hand, and over here on the right side is the palm of the hand, just for reference, in case it's tough to see exactly what I'm doing here. So let's pull this down a little. And one thing that we'll want to do when working with the hand as a single unit like this is to make sure that the palm of the hand over here on the right side and the back of the hand over here on the left side have fairly equal textile density, and one way we can do that is by making sure that the fingers are roughly the same length. So I'm going to take this middle finger and I'm going to look at where the geometry is laid out, and I'm just going to start pulling it around so that it's fairly even, so that each of these is fairly even. There we go. We're going to delete that one. Oops. Add one right there. Oop. There we go. Come on. There we go. Alrighty. So I'm just going to work on this for a few minutes here just to get things nice and even. And then we can start talking about what I mentioned before, which is unwrapping the hand as multiple pieces. And the way that I'm going to be doing that is by actually unwrapping the hand so that the palm and wrist are one island, or potentially even two islands, and then each of the fingers is unwrapped to its own UV island. There we go. There's the middle finger. This one is ring finger. It's looking kind of weird and bulbous, but that's okay. We can fix it. Now here, between the fingers, we want those to also be fairly well aligned. So let's see if we can fix that. Here we go. This is starting to look a lot better. Alrighty. So the key thing here with the fingers, when you're unwrapping them, is that they should roughly match the same shape as, or the same cross section as the actual 3D fingers. So roughly rounded tip and then fairly straight along the sides. Oops. Let's just remove that. Move this over. And obviously there are going to be some things that are difficult to achieve. Here you can see that the tip of the pinky doesn't quite match up, so we can move that down a little bit. Oops. Move that down. And we'll probably want to have the areas between the fingers in corresponding spots for both the top and the bottom, so we'll move them up or down depending upon where they are on the UVs. All right, so this is pretty rough. I would, at work I would probably spend a few hours just making sure that the UVs for the hand are right, because they're an area where people are going to be looking at it a lot. So I would, take my time and make sure that everything was laid out very neatly and cleanly, just so that it's easier to work on later on. Being very neat and clean with your work is super useful because it means that there's less work that you have to do later on down the road. If you invest the time in the initial product, it makes it so that the work you do later on with that product is significantly reduced. But there we go. This right here is certainly not perfect, but it is a perfectly serviceable UV map for a hand. Now there is some overlap which could be fixed, but it can be fixed fairly easily. For example, I could take and I could select these edges and say I could straighten them out. And I could do the same with the edges on the other finger. And what that'll do is it'll make it so that between 2 points, these are just straight lines and they don't intersect with each other. That's something I do with finger UVs at home. If you relax this with the boundaries locked, it will relax those areas so that they have better texel density. But let's take a look at this with a texture applied to it and see what we get. Let's increase the size so that the tiling is more apparent. Alright. So as you can see, with a single island, it becomes much easier to get very even texel density between two completely different parts. Now, here on the index finger, you can see I'm selecting these areas, and then on the UVs, I'm selecting corresponding areas automatically. They're on completely separate parts of the UVs, but because I'm unwrapping it as a single unit, and I'm aligning, say, the tips of the fingers, the lines of the joints, that makes it easier to get very even texel density, even if there are, misalignments and stuff. So, for example, here you can see that there's a big old seam. However, because the texel density is similar, it'll be much easier to hide that seam. The big key is making sure that you have corresponding areas lined up together, even if they are on vastly different parts of the UVs. So we make these linear and then relax them again. They start to straighten out. And that's actually one thing that you can do if you want to reuse UVs between many different models. If you're working on an MMO and you have lots of gloves or hands that are supposed to be shared between many different types of models, maybe even different, species or something in your game, maybe that's something you'd want to do. You might even want to align individual vertices on either side so that vertically or horizontally they are in exactly corresponding places. Something else you might want to do, depending upon how your game works, depending upon what technology or shaders you're using, you might want to make it so that the entire edge of the wrist along here is actually a straight line, like so. And what that will do is make it so that when this entire UV set for the hand is aligned with one edge of the 0 to 1 UV space, you could actually make it so that it aligns perfectly with the arm UVs in that corresponding place. So, for example, I can take the UVs for this arm. I'm not going to do the whole arm just because this part right down here is pretty much a cylinder, just a slightly deformed cylinder. I can, oops. Okay, let's do that again. Let's select all this stuff, hide the rest. Now, if I take and I unwrap along that same seam for the arm, one thing that I can do is, after I have made sure that this has been relaxed a bit more, I'll unlock the boundary. And then, oops, let's just do a little bit more relaxing on here just to make sure that things are cool. Alright, one thing that I can do along here is make sure that this edge right here, which is the same as the one on the wrist, actually aligns with the wrist. So if I make this align, and I sort of rotate these things around, I can take this, take it right down to the edge, rotate things and do some snapping and such so that they're perfectly aligned. At that point, what you get is, now obviously these would be much more relaxed and such, but you will get very nice continuous UVs along here, well, in theory, by just aligning the corresponding vertices. Oops. So if I do this, here, you know what I'll do? I'll just take and select these, make them linear, make the spacing uniform, align that, and that. Select that again, make it flat. Now this is a super rough example, but you can see that these edges now line up. So now if I say merge these vertices together, I can then, oops, lock the boundary, relax it, make sure it's linear again. Oop. Do this. Now we have perfectly aligned UVs, which can then be separated off onto two separate UV channels, or two separate UV maps, and this will make it so that you can get perfectly seamless edges between your arm and your wrist. This is super useful for having shared UVs. This is something that I have done at work before, and it's something I'm definitely going to repeat again. And it makes it so that sharing clothing, sharing things like gloves and forearms and all kinds of other stuff is super easy between different models. But that's an entirely other topic for a different day. So let's get back to just the hand. Now let's unwrap the hand as multiple UV islands and see what that gives us for as far as UV distortion is concerned, as far as texel density is concerned. You notice that with the hand unwrapped this way, there's a lot of wasted UV space. There's this entire area right below this half of the thumb, and then there's this area up here, which also represents wasted UV space. Now that is UV space that could have stuff packed into it. So we're now going to take this hand and unwrap it in a different way. We're just going to make a new UV texture. We'll call this one separate islands so that we know what we're looking at. We'll call this one single island. There we go. So now as we switch between those, we'll be able to know which one is which. Alrighty, so this is going to be pretty different from the last UV map, and it's going to be different for the reasons I just laid out. Increasing texel density, increasing the amount of the UV map that you use, making sure that you have less distortion. Despite the fact that we have fairly even texel density across this entire thing, there are some areas like in here where if we want the thumbs to line up, it's very difficult to do that without getting weird distortion. So separating off individual fingers in the UVs is a great way to make it so you don't have as much distortion like this. So let's do that. We're going to select rings around the fingers, around the base of the fingers. And what that's going to do for us is make it so that we can separate the fingers off to their own islands and unwrap them very similarly to how you would unwrap a simple cylinder. So we're going to have, let's see here, have this, this. There we go. So since the fingers basically are simple cylinders, simple 8-sided cylinders right now, it's going to be pretty easy to unwrap them. And there's going to be a few different ways that we can unwrap the tips of them to decrease distortion or make it so that they have fewer texture seams. And another advantage of unwrapping the hand as multiple separate pieces is that we can move some of the UV seams so that we hide them. So previously we had a UV seam that was going along this line, but that's not necessarily what we might want. This area right here is going to be very visible, so something we can actually do now is move that UV seam down here to a place where it's going to be less visible all the time. And we can make it so that there's a UV seam that goes here instead of along here. Now we could have the UV seam on the single island approach go along the backside here. It's a little easier to match things up if it goes along this line. And you know what? Just for funsies, let's have the front and back separated off into their own UV islands as well. Okay, so this is going to be the start of it, and then we're going to unwrap the individual fingers in just a second. So let's unwrap these. Ooh, looks like we missed an edge when we were unwrapping. That would be the edges between the fingers, right in here. So let's make sure we do that. There we go, that's better. So let's unwrap that. Alright, so we've got some weird stuff going on here because we have lots of big cylinders that don't really have a lot of cuts in them, but what we do have are the fronts and backs of the hand unwrapped. And if we just have these selected, unwrap them again, you can see that here we have the palm, which it's pretty easy to see the shape of. Here is the thumb. Here's the back of the hand. So we go like this. It's a little easier to see where it corresponds to. There we go. So here's the palm. Here are the areas that separate the fingers. Here's that line going along the outside. And what this is going to do for us is drastically reduce the amount of distortion that we get. So if we go back to the texture view, we resize these so the tiling is more apparent. What we see is that, for example, areas going into tightly deforming spots, like between the fingers, they don't get nearly as much distortion as they did with... Oops, we've been unwrapping to the wrong UV set. Oh well, that's fine. We don't really need to worry about it that much. Let's just copy this and paste it there. There we go. So this area in here has a lot less distortion than we would expect. If we subdivide it, you can see that you get really, really clean stuff going on in there. It's very nice. So let's unsubdivide that. And let's now unwrap the fingers. Okie dokie. Here we go. Don't need that. Alright, let's hide everything else and just do the fingers now. So, just like before, we're actually going to take advantage of the seam going along the middle of the fingers. But we might want to do some different things with the fingertips. So this guy's fingertips aren't very rounded along certain axes. That shouldn't matter too much, but there are things that we can do later on if we want to further decrease distortion. So if we unwrap like this, we're going to get super duper clean, largely undistorted UVs, aside from some areas in the fingertips. And I'll go into why the fingertips are distorted in just a second. But if we start out with this, it is going to give us some problems. Namely, 10 islands for the front and back, because we selected along that central seam. Now, if you want to use the multiple UV island solution for hands, having the central seam like this isn't necessarily as important, although it can still help. For example, it's very helpful if you have a single finger like this and you want to have it split up so that it's one island, but it's still easy to select how you unwrap that island. Having a single loop around the finger like this makes it super easy to just select stuff. Now, if you have some sort of weird spirally configuration going on with the model and UVs and stuff, then it's going to be a little more difficult. Then you're going to run into problems unwrapping it. But in this case, since I have this central seam, I can just double click and then deselect anything I don't want, unwrap it, and when you look at texture view, in theory, it should, oh, you know what's happening? My texture is assigned to the wrong UV set. Let me just change that real quick. There we go. Cool. So we have some really clean stuff. There isn't a ton of distortion, although you will notice that just depending upon the way the finger is bent, it might unwrap a little wonky. But we can just go and relax that. There are lots of different ways that you can relax stuff like this. And this is something you'll see in lots of different programs. This is not something that's exclusive to Moto. You know, Maya and Max have stuff like this built in. And you can essentially just unwrap it like you would a cylinder. And if you have fingertips that look like this, it makes it even easier to unwrap like a cylinder, because one of the things that you can do is, instead of just having a line going along like this, you can have lines, or rather seams, that go like this, and you can unfold it almost like origami, where the tip of the finger folds outwards, is connected right here, and uses this edge as a hinge to fold out and become less distorted. So if we relax, if we relax this, and we take a look at the texture view, we have almost no distortion. Now granted, there's a tiny bit of distortion just because it has to bend along a three-dimensional shape, but you sort of get the idea. This is incredibly smooth. The textile density is very, very even. The only problem with this is that you now have multiple edges and multiple seams in a very small, tightly packed area. This right here can potentially lead to normal map seams, various types of texture seams. It's very difficult to paint out any errors like this in a program like Photoshop if you're just looking at the textures. So this is something to bear in mind if you decide to unwrap fingers like this. The same goes for the rest of the fingers, of course. So let's do the rest of the fingers. And once again, I'm happy to take more questions in the Twitch chat, because over the next few minutes, as I'm finishing up the fingers for this guy, I'm going to have a little bit less material to talk about for tonight's session, just because tonight is mainly focused on the UVs of hands. So feel free to fire away if there's something you want to talk about or something you want to ask about. Once I'm done unwrapping these multiple islands, I'm then going to go back to the single island approach and start removing some of the distortion, aligning things nicely, and that'll be mostly just focused on me working So if that's, if that's just something you want to watch, feel free to just kind of watch. But feel free to also ask questions during that period because I'll be more than happy to answer them. So let's just finish unwrapping some of these fingers. The thumb is an area where you can place seams in a couple of different ways. For example, if it's a first-person shooter and you have this hand, you're probably going to be seeing sort of the meat of the thumb over here a lot. So you probably don't want to have too many seams in that area. So one thing you might want to do is have the seam going along the inside of the thumb over here, kind of like we had before. That way, any potential seam along here will be hidden. So let's just unwrap that guy. All right, so we've got a question in chat. Are there agreed upon file formats in which the meshes go further along the pipeline? Are there losses or any gotchas for different file formats and file types? Yeah, there are lots of commonly used 3D file formats out there. Each one is used in different ways, so there are benefits and drawbacks to each one. However, there are a couple of file formats out there right now that are the most prominent and most widely used, and those would probably be OBJ and FBX. The reason that most people use OBJ is that you can use them in almost any program, any 3D program that exists. If there is a 3D program out there, it can probably read the OBJ format. The OBJ format is pretty old, but it's also been very standardized and hasn't changed very much in, say, the past 10 or 15 years. There might have been small additions or edits to that file format, but it's remained largely the same. And because of that, it's very well known, very well supported, and the standards that are used for that file format are, easy to implement in whatever 3D program you have. The drawbacks to using OBJ are many, however. For example, OBJ does not support multiple UV channels. So if you, for example, want to have a character that has wrinkle maps that turn on and off depending upon whether an arm is bent or whether a certain type of rig activates that wrinkle map, you simply can't do that by using OBJ because it can only store a single set of UV coordinates. Additionally, OBJ doesn't actually support anything like bones or rigging, weight maps, anything along those lines. Basically, all OBJ stores is the model, the actual 3D mesh, the vertex normals, and occasionally a couple of other types of vertex, vertex data maps that are associated with the vertices and the polygons. So for example, you can have vertex normals that are stored in an OBJ, which are different from the vertex normals you get from just modeling something. So if I turn on this vertex normal toolkit and add some hard edges in here, it's going to change. You'll notice that the shading on the entire finger changed along with adding these hard edges. What this does is it changes the vertex normals from being just averaged across the entire thing to being face weighted, meaning that a larger face will impact the shading in different ways than a smaller face. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it because I partially don't understand it. But OBJ will support things like vertex normals like you see here. So these hard edges will be stored in an OBJ file format. However, if you want to do something like import an OBJ into Unreal 4, I believe Unity now, and various other programs that support different tangent bases, which are ways of calculating the direction of the normals coming off of, or the vertex normals and face normals. In that case, you might not have all that information in the way that you would want it. Additionally, OBJ doesn't support things like light positions. It doesn't support things like advanced texturing. It doesn't support the locations of lights. Yeah, lights or cameras. No bones, no weights, nothing like that. FBX, on the other hand, does support bones, weight painting, various different types of vertex and face normals. FBX supports multiple UV channels. I'm not sure of the maximum number of UV channels for an FBX, but it's a pretty large number. FBX also supports things like vertex color and multiple different types of texturing. And those that information is stored in the FBX. However, there are multiple versions of FBX out there, and the latest version of FBX just came out, I think, last year. There might even be a 2017 version of FBX, and the file format is a lot like, say, a type of program. It has certain types of information that it is capable of storing. Some of that information is human readable. For example, you could actually, very similarly with an an OBJ, you could open up the file in a text editor and go and look at the actual XYZ vertex positions as they are delineated by numbers, by floating point numbers. A lot of that is human readable, and it's easy to write programs that read that information. In other cases, that stuff is not human readable. It is stored in binary formats, which is literally ones and zeros. But the best thing about FBX is that it's so flexible and it supports so many different types of data stored in a file. Other file formats you see out there are, I believe it's DAE, which is the Collada file format. It supports lots of different file information, such as, bones, weight painting, camera and light positions, various different types of, say, blend shapes. That's one of the ones that we use, or that our engine at work uses, and it does that mainly because it can store so many different types of information. It's also possible to customize that file format, I believe, to suit your individual needs. I mean, it's possible to customize any sort of file format depending upon the engine and technology you're using. But as far as I know, Collada is easier to edit than most. There is a file format that was developed by engineers at Pixar and Disney, which is becoming slightly more common, and they're, I believe, writing a plugin for Maya and 3D Studio Max, which should make it available to the public fairly soon, though I'm not entirely sure when. And it's, I believe, called the Universal 3D Scene format or something along those lines. And it's actually capable of not just storing things like, bones, mesh data, and texture data, but it's also capable of things like UDIMs and, lots of different texturing formats that are not currently available for FBX, DAE, or OBJ. So those are the things you'll run into most often, and it's pretty useful to get sort of comfortable and accommodated to those types of file formats, because one of the things that you'll run into is using each one of those things daily, using each one of, those pieces of knowledge on a daily basis if you are working in a studio. It's good to know the limitations and uses of each of those. So there are some other questions. Now, between the different unwrapping methods, which is best? Less seams on a model, and where there are seams, let's see here. Less seams on the model, or where there are seams that have none invisible areas. So it's kind of tough to answer which method is best, because each method of, say, UV mapping or modeling or whatever is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. The main strength of unwrapping, say, a hand as multiple UV islands is that you will drastically decrease the amount of texture stretching that you get. So, for example, what's going on here? For example, on this model, you'll notice that where before I had lots of distortion in this area between the thumb and forefinger, especially on this upper part of the hand, now there's almost no distortion whatsoever. The texel density is very even. It's very clean looking. However, the problem you run into is that, yes, you do have lots more UV seams to account for. So, oops. So, let's see here. So all of these right here, these are UV seams, and these are areas where you might actually run into problems if you have, any number of different things going on, but especially if you have, say, tiling textures for cloth or for different types of wear and tear. If you have lots of seams like this, those tiling textures aren't going to play very well with that tiling, because the orientation is going to be vastly different between each one of those edges. However, let's just take a look at this hand and take a look at how things are tiling. Okay, so things are very, very even now, or at least the distortion has been minimized. If I pack these up a little bit, let's not orient them right now. Let's make this bigger so the tiling is more evident. Yeah, so here we can see that distortion, UV distortion, has been wildly reduced. Areas like between the fingers, between the thumb and forefinger, all those have much better density than they did before with just a single UV island. But, as I just mentioned, having these multiple UV islands makes it more difficult to texture. So those are the differences. Those are the things that you have to look out for. And if you have something like a pair of gloves on a character, you might actually want to unwrap along the actual seams of the glove. If this was a glove, there would actually be cloth seams along where these UV edges are. So I could very easily unwrap it there, and then if I had, say, a tiling cloth or leather texture on there, you wouldn't notice, because that tiling cloth or leather texture is going to be hiding in a seam anyway, and it will look natural. So that's something else to keep in mind. So another question is, do you use a UV packing tool either at work or on personal projects, or would you recommend one? Yes, I do, and yes, I would. So there is a program that is available on Steam right now. I don't know if there are standalone licenses at the moment, at least, but there is a program called iPackThat, uh, and it's IPACKTHAT, all one word. And what it does is it takes all your UV islands and does the same packing procedure that you would see in, well, if I just hit the pack UVs right here, it does something very similar to that. However, the difference is that it has a far superior algorithm to anything that I have seen in any other program. And so if you have, for example, a ring of polygons on your UVs and then other smaller islands that could fit inside that ring, it will account for that and it will place them inside there. It will also allow you to do things like pack your UVs so that they have a certain number of pixels between the different islands. And it will allow you to put, padding around the edges of the UVs. It will allow you to specify which parts of your UVs are rectangles. And it's very, very good for unwrapping characters that have lots of complex pieces or lots of very small pieces that have to be unwrapped individually and then given their own separate UV islands. It's also absolutely excellent for doing light map UVs because, once again, it allows you to specify the pixel distance between UV islands. And what that means is that if you know the pixel distance between UV islands, you can actually know how much padding you can actually give your UV islands. Now that's something that will come up a lot when you're working with LOD meshes. If your LODs, your level of detail meshes, have UVs that don't have enough padding between islands, you're actually going to run into situations where you get lots of bleeding between different islands, even if you have a little bit of space between them. So sometimes packing as tightly as possible, like right here, this might not be optimal because you're limited on your texture size. So if I was looking at this, I might have unwrapped this to a 2048 texture, but this right here, this space, might actually be smaller than a single pixel, meaning that as I zoom out from that texture, as the texture gets smaller with maps, there's going to be a lot of bleed between this UV island and this one. So having that preset amount of space between your islands is going to make it much easier for you to account for your texture sizes. So yes, I would recommend iPackThat. It's very, very useful. I use it all the time at work, and I've found that it's just simply one of the best packing algorithms out there. Now the caveat there is that if you have very complex models, it can take a long time to run. However, it will be just as fast, if not faster, for you to run that program than it will be for you to sit there and manually pack each individual island yourself. Something else that it does very nicely is actually gives you a percentage of how much of the UVs are being used by your UV islands and by the wasted space around your UV islands. It'll give you an actual percentage number, and then you can see and get actual quantifiable information about how much space is being used or wasted. Alrighty. So here is our guy's hand, all unwrapped as multiple pieces, and we've sort of talked about the benefits and drawbacks of having multiple islands versus a single island hand. That's most everything that I really wanted to talk about today. The rest just comes down to making sure that your hand attaches to the rest of the body, or the arm, which attaches to the rest of the body. And having multiple islands like this doesn't mean that you can't do fun tricks like having the arm seam and the wrist seam line up. You could still have that. You would just need to arrange your UV islands differently. So another question I've got is, for human hands, do you use separate geometry for the nails, or is it all one mesh? And for that, I would say it depends. It depends on a few things. One thing would be how close you're actually going to be looking at the hands. If you're going to have close-ups on the hands, where you're actually going to be seeing pores, the lines on fingernails, fingerprints, that type of thing, it might actually be in your best interests to separate out the fingernails from the rest of the finger so that you get a very nice clean separation, and maybe even use a different shader for the fingernails versus the skin. However, if you're doing something that's even like a first-person shooter in a lot of cases, where you're going to have hands on screen a lot, but you're not going to be focusing on them, in that case, usually it's fine to have the fingernails merged in with the rest of the hand, because there's still some things you can do to have fingernail geometry without having to worry about having them as separate pieces. So for example, if this guy had fingernails instead of, the claws that he's going to have poking out of here, one thing that I could do is select the area with the fingernail, and we'll say that that area is right here. And let's just smooth that out just a little. Oh, maybe not smooth it out that much. So let's select this area, smooth it out just a little so that it's slightly more fingernail-y shaped. And then here is where we can start making shapes that are a lot like fingernails. So in this case, probably what I'd want to do is, let's just align these. Probably don't want them even. There we go. So now that we have this general shape for the fingernail, there's a couple things we can do. One, we can make it so that the fingernail looks like it's actually embedded into the finger by rotating a little bit like this. And then another thing we can do is have either this part come out like that to imply that fingernail shape, and let's just move this down so that it's more fingernail-y. And this can give a pretty decent result. I mean, this is clearly a suboptimal situation, but yeah, this can give a pretty good result, and you can see that it kind of smooths okay. But there is a problem area here, namely these two polygons right here. These are the polygons where you're going to run into problems because of the way that most human fingernails are shaped, they tend to have a slightly sharper point right over here, right in this area. It's either pointed or slightly curved, and what that means is that these two polygons are usually going to be fairly non-planar. So this one right here, you can see from a glancing angle, it starts to take on kind of a V shape, and that can introduce some problems. So you'll want to either triangulate that, like so, and flip that around, or one thing you can do is have another bit of geometry in here that gets kind of pushed in, and that will allow you to smooth out those non-planar polygons a bit and lessen the effect, lessen the artifact you'll get when baking, and make it so that you don't have to triangulate them as early. Now, once again, this is a suboptimal example because this is not actually a human hand, but it's close enough to a human hand where the example still holds up. Now, granted, this is also an area where if you're doing this for, say, a third-person game where There might be like lots of civilians running around or something, and you're not going to be paying too much attention to them. This is overkill, and you really won't need this type of detail. You'll probably only ever need some sort of, rounded fingertips that just have fingernails baked into them. For very, very close-ups, though, you'll probably want to have at least something like this so that you can get the general fingernail shape. And once again, at work, this is something I've done. I've put the basic fingernail shape in there, even if it's not 100% detailed, just so that we have the supporting geometry for when we bake things, when we have things in cutscenes, where things need to be fairly detailed. All right. Well, it's approaching 8:30 here in California, and I've mostly covered basically everything that I wanted to for tonight's stream. I'm gonna kind of open it up to questions now over the next, say, half hour, and if it turns out that there aren't too many more questions, I'm going to probably shut the stream down a little bit early, hop into the private hangout with people who signed up for it, and then maybe call it a little bit of an early night. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Twitch chat. Questions about really anything. We've had questions about file formats and, different UV packing tools and stuff. So it's not just related to talking about hand UVs tonight. So if you have anything you want to bring up or anything you want to ask, fire away. Otherwise, probably around 8:30. That's, about 5-7 minutes from now. I'll probably start shutting down this stream, thanking you for the good night, and then start calling it a weekend shortly thereafter. So, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask or any comments they want to make? Anything along those lines? So here's a question from the chat. I'm interested in working as a character artist in the Bay Area. Is there a place where I can find a list of game studios in that area? Yeah, actually, there are a few online resources for finding game art jobs, just game jobs in general, not just game art jobs, across the industry in multiple locations. There is a website. Let me just pull it up so that I'm not giving you the wrong URL. One second. Let's see here. All right. So if you go to Orca HQ, that's ORCAHQ.com, that is actually a long list of entries from game recruitment sites, sites of game developers where they post their job listings. Yes, they even scrape from Gamasutra.com. They take those, they compile them onto one big long page, and they have a search engine for it. And they also have a lot of categories. So I can just pull that up right over here. If you just go to Orca HQ and scroll down to Browse Jobs, or just go to orcahq.com/jobs. They have a ton of listings on there. You can actually see up here at the top, without even putting any sort of qualifiers in here or keywords, it returned currently 8,689 results. Now you can sort these. You can you can sort them by relevance, date, distance. You can put in like a zip code. So 12345. That'd be Schenectady, New York, or Schenectady, or however you pronounce it, and that'll come up with the closest listings to that that area code, or the zip code rather. You can also sort by art, design, engineering, production, QA, along with a bunch of other areas, and it'll make these lists longer or shorter depending upon what is in those areas. I've used this before when I was looking for jobs. It's really, really handy, and I know a lot of other people who have found jobs through here, and a lot of these links actually go to just directly to the game developers' websites. So for example, this one, software engineer, infrastructure, a new grad. This one is open to a new graduate from school, and it goes directly to the careers.unity.com page. So there you go. So that one right there is a great place to look for game studios in basically any area. But yeah, you could look, say, in the San Francisco, California area here. Looks like there's nothing really open right now, but you would want to check back from time to time, and just make sure that you keep your finger on the pulse of the hiring situation. You will find that as you're looking for jobs in the industry, there are times when hiring and not hiring and firing, but hiring and, say, layoffs or contract end dates tends to correspond to different times of the year. Hiring tends to happen most at the beginning of the year, say between probably around GDC and June. So from probably between early March and the middle of summer is when a lot of places are looking to staff up. And later in the year, around the holidays is when they're looking for people a little less, because they're just not ramping up projects very much around the start of the new year. But just because of when certain industry events happen, like GDC or other big game development related conferences and such, which tend to be towards the beginning of the year, that's when most of the hiring happens. So there is sort of a rhythm to this type of thing. So if you're looking for a job in the game industry, it's usually best to start looking around the beginning of the year. Now, granted, there will be exceptions to that, just because, some people move on from their jobs to others at different points during the year, but the largest hiring pushes tend to happen towards the beginning of the year, around March, April, and go through the summer. So that's something useful to keep in mind, especially if you're either a new grad or you're just about to leave school. That's something you'll want to look out for as you are approaching graduation, or as you are starting to dip your toes into the sort of employment pool out there. If you'll excuse me, I'm just going to step away for a moment. But if you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in chat. I'll only be gone for about 2 minutes. I just have to go and use my inhaler. Have a touch of asthma, but I'll be right back. All right, sorry for the slight delay there. So we've got another question in chat. I've never been to GDC and I would like to go. What should I look out for or do if I want to find work there? That's a very good question. And it's something that actually comes up a lot, especially around GDC time, which I believe in 2018 is going to be in mid-March. I think from something like the 18th to the 23rd. I might be mistaken about those dates, so don't take them as gospel. But finding work at GDC is a big topic out there, and from everything I've seen and heard, a lot of the hiring that happens at GDC is not actually a direct result of going to things like the Career Pavilion or, actual distinct GDC brand things, events like that, but instead it's more focused on doing things like going to parties where there are going to be lots of other people who are looking to hire. So, for example, the Polycount GDC party, which is now usually the Polycount / Marmoset Co. GDC party, is usually held at a bar, and it's just a big gathering of a bunch of artists all in one place. And, you'll find that if you go to events like that, a lot of the people there will be people from lots of different companies who are either, if not specifically looking to hire somebody at that party, they're looking to make contacts with people who they could hire. Additionally, there are more formally organized events that are absolutely for hiring, and they even sort of have it in their names. So, for example, companies like Epic Games, Blizzard, Riot, Activision to some degree, EA, Microsoft, a lot of these companies, they will throw mixers during GDC specifically for hiring people, hiring new talent, looking for people, meeting with potential new employees, that type of thing. So if you want to go to GDC specifically looking for work, those are the places that you'll want to start looking. The Career Pavilion over the past, say, 5 or 6 years has sort of changed its focus and gotten a lot smaller, and a lot of the companies that are, say, presenting or having booths at the Career Pavilion at GDC tends to be ones that are less focused on the game development that you usually think of, which is developing things like, Call of Duty or World of Warcraft or any number of other recognizable brands, and more towards things like slot machine games, free to play any type of games, mobile games, Facebook games, that type of thing. And while some people find very good careers in those fields, it's definitely not for everyone. And that's why a lot of these hiring-focused parties have started to pop up over the last few years. So as GDC approaches towards March of the beginning of next year, you'll want to keep on the lookout for announcements about mixers and events like that, where there will be HR representatives, recruiters, leads from various different departments, and they're there specifically to look for new employees. And the reason that they throw these types of events is so that when they meet you, they're in a more relaxed setting. It's a lot looser, it's a lot more inviting, I guess I would say, than simply waiting in line to get your portfolio reviewed by somebody who might not even necessarily have the same expertise that you would be looking for. In a lot of cases, people at booths will not know a lot about, say, art or character or environment work. So the only things they'll be able to tell you are, look on our website if we're hiring. Whereas if you go to one of the hiring events, you'll have people who are slightly more specialized in hiring. So another question in the chat directly related to this is, are the times and dates for these parties public or invite only? And would I have to find somebody from Riot to invite me to the Riot party? And the answer to that is it depends. A lot of these events are invite only, but lots of them are just kind of air quotes invite only, because essentially they don't want the riffraff coming in without a badge from GDC or something. So, for example, over the past few years, companies like Riot or Epic have had events like this, and the only way that you could either get in or get drinks was by having a GDC pass. And if you are specifically looking for work at GDC, that might be a good investment. It might be a good investment to actually go and get a pass. Just get like a day pass, or the Expo Pass, which is the cheapest one, usually costs $100 or $200, something like that. And if it finds you work, it's a great investment. It means you immediately get a return on your investment. As for the times and dates being publicized, they're not very widely publicized. However, as long as you keep an eye out for event pages and stuff related to GDC around the time that GDC is coming up, you'll usually find info about them, and then from there you can start making inquiries and even directly email some people who post that information, or directly contact them through social media like Facebook or Twitter, or even going on to like live streams that they might do. I can't really say that I would be involved with anything like that, but there are lots of other folks who do live streaming events similar to this, and they'll have involvement in those types of events. So, if there aren't really any other questions, I think now that I've sort of demonstrated different methods for UVs, I'm going to probably start calling it a night, getting into the private hangout with the people who signed up. And then next week, I'll be talking about a few different topics, sort of weaving them together. My current plan is to finish off this guy's body. I'm going to be closing up his mouth, fully attaching the rest of his head, and, closing up his eyes and stuff. I'm going to be getting his claws done, and I'm going to be starting to talk about the little accessories and stuff that I'm going to be making for this guy. So, clothing, some shackles around his wrists, and maybe one or two of his ankles. I'll be talking about the different design choices I'm making for things like his clothing, so that I can model them effectively. I'll be talking about, just kind of a slew of different topics, and each one of them is going to be kind of connected to the other, so each day is going to be sort of blending into the next one, and each day will be covering multiple different topics in multiple different ways. The focus of next Tuesday's stream, however, will be body UVs. UVs specifically for this guy's body. How I would lay out the UVs for his body, how things might be different if I have clothes on him, and just generally talking about how I'm going to be getting him ready for the final steps of doing things like creating his clothes and bringing him into Marvelous Designer, the steps involved in getting those clothes from Marvelous Designer to ZBrush to a final polished state. I'm going to be talking about the first steps for each of those things, and then over the next 3 sessions after that, I'll be talking more about finishing up the model, giving him, things like hair cards, clothing, accessories. I'm going to be talking about hard surface, specifically about how it applies to character artists. So if those are interesting to you, if those are things that you want to, find out about, tune in next week on Tuesday and then on Wednesday. The Like I said before at the beginning of the stream, I'm not going to be here on Thursday like I usually am next week. That's the 24th. I'm going to be on both Tuesday and Wednesday at the same time. And on Thursday, you should probably go and check out a talk that some of my coworkers are giving at the Gnomon School. It's called Become a Better Game Artist, and it's going to be given by Gavin Goulden, who is my lead, and Jason Hickey, who is the environment art lead. They're both from Insomniac Games. They're both really accomplished artists. They're both cool guys. I like them both a lot. And I'm actually going to be attending that, even though I'm not going to be speaking. So that's why I'm not going to be doing the stream on that day. So yeah, Wednesday of next week at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time is when I'll be doing the second stream. So 2 stream days in a row. And as a bonus, this won't conflict with things like Critical Role or any TV shows you might be watching. So there's that. All right. So with that, since there are no further questions in the Twitch chat, I'm going to be logging off in just a couple seconds here. Thank you for watching. If you like this content, if you like the things I'm doing, just let me know. And next week I'm going to start talking about some of the topics that I'll be covering in my next workshop, which will be starting up next month. I'm going to be talking mostly about texture creation. I'm going to be talking about how to bake textures, how to paint textures, how to make textures in things like Substance Painter. I'm going to be, touching on all kinds of different topics, and I'd love to get some sort of feedback from you guys on the different types of topics related to texturing that you'd like to see. I think it's going to be a pretty popular one because the one that I did about materials and rendering was pretty popular. That seems to be a pretty big topic that people like, so hope the next one's very successful as well. So yeah, I'm going to sign off now, so thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to be heading off to the private hangout. You guys have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. Have a good one.